Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I had a joke planned about how they'd save the best panel for last, but given the topic they've asked us to discuss today, I think they've saved the most complex for last, and they've only given us 20 minutes, so we have a tall order here. We know that we know how important critical minerals are for the energy transition, and thankfully, standards are rising across the world for how they're produced. We heard from several speakers earlier today along those lines. But however, market manipulation and lack of transparency can undercut that competition and undermine the drive to improve standards. So how can industry overcome these hurdles? Joined today by Bryce Crocker, the Chief Executive Officer of Jervois Global, a cobalt and nickel company, as well as Julian Treger, the President, CEO, and Director of CoTeC Holding, which invests in technology to boost production across the industry and lower the industry's carbon footprint. Thank you both for being with us here today. I want to start with a question for both and maybe go to Bryce first. Bryce, we've seen a lot of volatility in the commodity markets in the past year for critical minerals, cobalt especially, which you're directly familiar with. Can you just sort of share your thoughts on key factors contributing to these fluctuations right now?
Sure. So for cobalt, it's actually quite simple. The policy deliberations are complex, but the reason is simple. There's a single mine in the DRC called Kasanfu, 60,000 tonne capacity in the 200,000 tonne market. So I'm no longer involved in the oil business, but ballpark, that's 3 times the size of OPEC coming on overnight. So that's going to have an impact. And it's cobalt that the market ostensibly doesn't need. So the SRB is stockpiling, it's going into China, it's flooding outside of China and essentially just crushed the price from $40 a pound to $15 a pound. So that's awkward. Obviously, the geology is the geology, and 75% of cobalt does come from the DRC. Over 80% of the materials refined in China. So in the mining industry, we tend to work in quartiles. And some of our peers that were up here earlier from the big companies, they're in the bottom quartile. 75% comes from the DRC, so by default, the cobalt mine, we've invested $155 million at 8,000 feet in Idaho. It's going to sit at the top. And what that means is when you have an event such as a cobalt mine the world essentially didn't need, we shut.
Gotcha. Julian, your thoughts?
But I think we've seen not only this happening in cobalt, but as we've seen from the previous talker, in nickel, also in lithium, also in rare earth. So it's sort of coincidental that a large number of the inputs to batteries seem to have had a tremendous price fall almost at the same time this year. And one does wonder whether there are more strategic powers at work, and this is going to be similar to what happened to solar panels previously.
Gotcha. Let's push into that a little bit because you and Jervois, Bryce, last year sort of lived this directly when you made a strategic decision for one of your assets in Idaho. You're competing basically with non-market actors for market share right now. Can you talk about sort of that decision and what led you to it and what might happen, what could happen for you to reopen that asset?
Well, I think if we talk about Idaho specifically, I mean, I've been transparent with investors and with government, it needs a higher cobalt price. So the cobalt price today is $12.50 a pound. We sanctioned the investment as a board with an understanding of a $25 long term. So either the market price has to return to that level, or a customer has to underwrite that price, or government has to underwrite that price if the mine is going to remain stable and operational and not be a swing producer. So listen, I grew up in an era of non-government interference in commodity markets, so I don't like the third option intuitively, but equally we're dealing with a market that it's not a level playing field. Our competitors in China, they're vertically integrated. They operate to different governance standards, environmental standards, labour standards. And I think if you look at the way that the West needs to compete for those minerals that are genuinely important, not only for the energy transition, but also for national security. And obviously the energy transition is national security, but we're working with the DoD, for example, in Idaho. These critical minerals, they are important, and they're critical for many applications that we come to rely on as a country that doesn't necessarily share our values.
And what are the conversations like when you speak with governments, either in Washington or elsewhere, around the situation? I mean, if we want a more secure supply chain that doesn't rely on one area, what are some of the solutions that you offer them?
I think that governments have a challenge because they need to. We don't need to equalise the playing field completely. I mean, China controls 80%, 90% of cobalt chemicals that go into batteries. So we don't need to replicate that market share. But for those industries which have a national security implication, which are genuinely important, some degree of self-sufficiency as an insurance policy is important. And I think that the unfortunate events of Russia's invasion of Ukraine have illustrated as an example of an insurance policy. I think if you move forwards, it's really around how do you provide those mechanisms of support which are bespoke, which are proportionate, which don't distort the playing field. I'm an Australian, and obviously with those, the nickel industry in Australia is in a very difficult situation right now.
Yes.
I actually don't have a simple answer, and I'm not sure that government can necessarily intervene in that structural situation in a simple way. But for those commodities which are more bespoke, which are more limited, such as your rare earths, such as cobalt, which are critical for national security, I think that there is a difference between commodities aren't created equal. Copper is different from alloy, it's different from nickel, and cobalt and rare earths, they have very specific applications. We talk about the energy transition, but they also go into military purposes, hypersonic missiles that can land on aircraft carriers in Guam, in missile guidance systems, in warheads. And we just need to look at those commodities slightly differently, I think, and recognise the unique role that they play in national security and in our economy.
So you're suggesting that cobalt should perhaps be put into a class of special attention, if I'm understanding you correctly, by regulators?
I think that there's a limited group of commodities where the market is so overwhelmingly dominated by China, whether it's 80, 90%, and they can bring on a supply source that's 3 times the size of OPEC. I mean, let's not kid ourselves, this isn't a normalised commodity market.
Right.
And when these applications are so critical, there was a presentation earlier today that took us through some of the criticality of the defence applications. Our mine in Idaho, we produce 2,000 tonnes when we're operational, so that's approximately 10% of US demand. So we're not going to solve the US's problems, but we can go a long way to providing a limited but secure supply that goes into critical applications in the event of sustained industrial need to support whatever geopolitical needs that may require.
Gotcha. Julian, I want to turn to you here, and especially given your investment in the tech space, I'm wondering, are there innovative strategies that you would recommend or bring to market here that you think could sort of help with this rather complex situation?
Well, I do believe and agree with Bryce that very strategic defense-related minerals are in a separate category. But I'm a great believer in recycling and technology being used to unleash the deposits that are in the waste that already are in our economies and circulating in the economy as a whole. We have a business which can recycle magnets and recycle the rare earths in those. And I think that's the beginning of a way in which we can reduce the independence or reduce the dependence of the West on the Chinese supply chain. But I also believe, going back to an earlier speaker today, that we should look to the higher ground. We shouldn't try to compete with the Chinese on their playing ground. The US is blessed with some great natural endowments, particularly in gas and methane, hydrogen, and that's, I think, what should be focused on. So you leapfrog and play a different game if that's possible.
Gotcha. We heard some speakers earlier today talk about differential pricing, which I think is fair to say is one of the sort of themes thus far of the day. Should people be paying a different price for cobalt or nickel or copper produced at different standards? Welcome both of your thoughts.
Listen, they should, but they won't. I've been trading commodities my whole life, and ESG matters right up until the point when you're negotiating a contract and then the 3 criterion of price, price and price are put on the table. I can use a practical example. So from our business in Finland, we produce, we're actually delivering around 10% of the cobalt demand into the US today. So there is an ESG premium. So our product is priced quite differently to the Chinese. Our customers know that, and there is this delta. But our customer base is relatively small, and it was up until probably 12 weeks ago. This is where I think governments, the Inflation Reduction Act and the FEOC, so a lot of the cobalt that's coming out of China, it would get a lot of the automakers, it obviously ends up in Western supply chains. It's getting tolled through China. So of our 6,000 tonnes in Finland, we have about 3,000 tonnes of capacity to produce battery-grade sulfate. We're producing 2,000, only 2 today. So despite all the noise about EVs, we're actually got more capacity today than what we can sell. now we're getting overrun. So all of those Western OEMs, so these are US car companies, European car companies, and their supply chains that were tolling through China, now they're forced. So that ESG premium of whether it's $2, $3 per pound, but it's a significant premium. Previously, there was a finite market for that because it was up to customer discretion, and many of our customers would get up on stage and their CEOs would talk about ESG whilst at the same time as my traders are dealing with their commercial team and not necessarily translating that into decision making. What the IRA is doing in a concrete way is we're negotiating 9,000 to 10,000 tonnes of capacity from 2025 onwards now. So because again, the supply chains are so long here, so all of our new contracts require an FEOC restriction because we send a pound of cobalt from Finland to Japan that then comes back to the US. That's 12 months. So it's an example that we talk about the impact that these legislation and regulations are having, but we're witnessing a real differentiational pricing impact for our product today that's being embedded because of the IRA, which is ultimately, I believe, positive, obviously.
And do you think that's sustainable in the long term?
I'm not from the United States. You'll have to tell me if the IRA is going to get repealed.
Come back in 12 months. Julian, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely should be a differential, but consumers won't pay for it. And what we're seeing is the short-term free market abutting against, longer-term planning. So I believe that there should be a carbon tax, and when that comes in, that will be a way in which that pricing will be legislated. And that is, I think, the theme of a lot of what we're talking about here. The stock market, which is very short-termist, is failing our sector, which is very long-termist. And it requires at this stage, because we're no longer dealing with a global free market, we're dealing with state actors with other agendas, that we've got to get some, unfortunately, for those who believe in the Adam Smith invisible hand, we've got to get more help.
I think ultimately ESG has a cost. So as a producer in Idaho, I couldn't bear that. I couldn't. We were going to lose money with every pound of cobalt we sold, so therefore we had to shut. So that cost has to get borne somewhere. Now I get that my customers don't want to pay it, but they only don't want to pay it because their customers don't want to pay it. Like somewhere along either government intervenes, and then it becomes a sustainability question, which I think that in the context of the Australian nickel industry, I think that's the biggest issue they have.
Right.
How long can you actually structurally, governments have a horrible track record over the last century at intervening in commodity markets and doing so successfully. But ESG does have a cost. I think it's a worthwhile cost. I'm sure the majority of the people in this room would agree, but that cost has to be borne and allocated in an efficient and sustainable way.
But you mentioned the IRA, Bryce. I mean, what does that actually look like, where the rubber actually meets the road for that price to be realized? I mean, it's certainly, you can insist on higher standards via the IRA or through partner countries with U.S. free trade deals that might operate at standards that are considered acceptable. But if you're not going to be able to get the price to pay for that, and the market is still flooded, as you experienced last year, then the IRA does not benefit. I mean, you are in the United States, and you had to take this decision with that asset.
Yeah, well, I guess if we're talking about the business from Finland and the sales from there, it's really FEOC. So if you've got a pound of cobalt in your vehicle from 25, you won't get the consumer won't get the 7,500 or the 3,750 credit because there's two components, critical minerals. But without that credit, you can't compete, which is why we're selling. There's a higher demand for our cobalt that's not tolled through China. We're the largest cobalt refinery outside of China in Kokkola, Finland. As it pertains to Idaho, I mean, we're working with the DoD. I'm really pleased with the engagement that we've had with US government. But equally, we've raised $750 million since the current team came into Jervois. We've got a $15 million grant from the DoD. We're drilling to expand the resource. We've got an extremely positive relationship with EXIM, who provided letters of support under CTIP and MMIA. And we're also studying with the DoD a cobalt refinery feasibility study. So it's moving in the right direction. But I think the key is really, it comes back to the public-private partnership. How can government have a huge impact through relatively moderate actions, through Halo, the Halo impact that it provides us in the private sector to go out and raise capital when investors know that the US government is kind of a tailwind, not a headwind. That's a big deal.
And
But I think the ESG premium is helpful at the margin for Western producers, but ultimately, if you're dealing with a situation where the commodity price drops 70%, that is a much bigger problem because it means that only the miners, probably in the first quartile, remain profitable. And that, I think, is something which really needs addressing, because if you are facing a situation of predatory pricing, which could last for 5 years, 7 years, I mean, they're saying that the nickel production is going to still come on till 2030, then you risk having a large section of your critical mineral supply chain wiped out in the West. And so it really is the price volatility which I think is the bigger issue.
And in the time we have remaining, I mean, maybe we could touch a third rail if you let us go there. I mean, tariffs. Should governments be using tariffs to ensure that metals produced at low ESG standards don't go into their countries or across their borders? And fully recognizing tariffs aren't popular with a lot of parties, but what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, it's not something we all have been brought up to want, but it may be justifiable for a period of time in order to give you breathing space. It's clear that, to my mind, particularly the West and the US need to rethink the idea of competing with the Chinese on their terms. So maybe some time out would be a good idea, as long as it's phased out in a way.
Yeah, we grew up with free trade underpinning everything that we were doing for most of us through most of our careers, and so tariffs, they're not something that necessarily we would automatically default to, but equally, where there's materials that are being supplied and mined in inappropriate ways, the UGAR Act is a good example of something that I think has widespread support. And the reality is that I think transparency on the supply chain is also important. So we purchase our raw materials in from Finland, and we go through an extremely high diligence process. There's a limited group of suppliers that are either Western constructed or Western operated facilities. And we have a secure supply chain that provides our customers confidence in terms of visibility on sourcing. The reality is that most of the industry doesn't necessarily operate that way, and I think greater transparency on the supply chain can encourage consumers to make different decisions over time.
That transparency, Bryce, do you feel like you gain customers because of that? Do you charge your customers more for that? Is it a nice add-on that you just give free of charge? Or how does that sort of play into your negotiations?
Listen, look, we're actually not making money right now. So when I say that there's a differential in pricing, it's because we need a certain price to survive. The Chinese operate at different standards, different scale, so their price is much lower, and we're not able to compete. I think that as you move forwards and as we talk to customers, I think the markets are going to become they're going to become more fragmented, and we strongly believe, it's kind of ironic, we don't have the customers to sell all the cobalt sulfate today, but yet we're exploring a cobalt refinery with the US government here, and we're talking to the European Union about expanding Kokkola. So the demand is coming, and there is an expectation that the standards associated with that are going to be different from what is acceptable in most of the industry today that's reliant on Chinese supply.
Julian, any thoughts on that?
Well, just on the tariff side, if you start with the raw materials, you've got to think about batteries, and then you've got to think ultimately about electric vehicles. So you have to have tariffs in the end on BYD cars coming into the US. So it's very you have to take a really integrated view in this whole question, which is very tricky.
And again, it gets down to, will the average consumer pay more for a product that is built with ethical critical minerals? I mean, paying for ethically sourced coffee is one thing, but paying X% more for an electric vehicle is different. So therein lies the tension point there around those really complex topics. Any last points, gentlemen? We've got about a minute left.
I just think we have to be able to compete. Our industries have to compete as well. So the House Committee on China came out with price stabilisation, and we had discussions around how we do that in a way that actually doesn't affect US industry, because clearly how you compete with China isn't by creating a higher cost base structurally that's going to exist indefinitely.
It's raising the bar, perhaps.
Raising the bar without reducing the competitiveness. The whole point of a lot of the policy is for us to compete to increase competition, successful competition, not to become less competitive.
And certainty is what we need for the longer term planning of our industry and its new supply, and how that's developed. Maybe there can be price puts provided by government. We need to think about these solutions.
Awesome. Well, Bryce, Julian, thank you both for your time, and thank you to the audience for sticking with us here until the very end. We know that we are the last panel keeping you from the reception, so thank you for your interest, and have a great day.
Thanks, Ed.